So, Dr. Bryson's asked me to come this semester to talk about really old drama and really old poetry, two things that no one pretty much actually reads anymore. So I'm hoping that through our discussions from last time as well as today that even if it may not be our preference for what we read, that we gain a little bit more respect for it and see the value that has lasted for 400 years and why it's still so relevant for us today if we're just willing to look at it. John Donne is one of my favorite poets, maybe my actual favorite poet, if not he's probably in the top three. And the reason why is because he lived a very interesting and conflicted life, which I'll talk briefly about. Like Shakespeare, he lived in an interesting time for creativity and interesting social movements. But he also, I think, reflects the mind of a lot of people, and especially, or I would assume, a lot of us. That's why I tend to gravitate toward John Donne's poems, is because I feel a little bit of myself when I read his work. And I'm hoping, or I'm curious to see, as you read, if you see some of yourselves in it as well, because I sat in your seats a long time ago. It's actually exactly 20 years now since I was your age, and I sat in classrooms just like this, and I read texts like you're reading, and that was on my own Christian college campus back in Indiana, but I was in your shoes, and like a lot of you probably, I was a Christian my whole life. My parents are Christians, my family's all Christians, and so it was easy growing up in a Christian household. Because that was what I knew, and that's what I believed, and I never really doubted it. But as I got to college, even though I was at a Christian college, and as already a Christian, that didn't mean I didn't have questions. Again, I don't know if I'd say doubts. I've never doubted my faith, but there's certainly things that the older I got and the more intelligent I got, the more I wondered about things, the more I was curious about things. Things didn't always seem as black and white as I had thought them to be. When you're a kid and you grow up in the faith, there's salvation and creation and redemption and Jesus and all these great Bible characters, and we get the main message, and I believe it, and that's great. But sometimes as you get older and you face the world, it gets a little bit more confusing, and so you do ask those kinds of questions, and I know as a college student, that's when I asked the most questions. Even though I was a Christian at a Christian college, I found myself asking all sorts of tough questions, and maybe that's you. What are we doing here? Why does this make any sense at all? Why did God make this in the first place? Why did he make it so hard? Why would he send his son to die for a nobody like me? All of those questions are valid ones that I know I thought about, and perhaps you've thought about them too. And those are the kinds of questions that I think John Donne wrestles with, and why he's so relatable from a human perspective. You're in a humanities class to study what it's like to be a human. And we saw Shakespeare write about what it's like in a fictional way to create personality and to reflect real world humans. But John Donne is a real world human. He is a devout Christian, and yet he really struggles in a number of ways with what his faith actually means. And those are some of the things that show up in his poems that we're going to talk about today. Let me grab my clicker. So to get us started, I titled this, "What are we talking about when we talk about poetry?" Because I understand it's not always people's first option when they are thinking about reading material, and many times it's quite difficult. I don't think Donne is overly difficult. I think there are people who are more difficult, but it's not exactly easy to get through in places. So what I often do is I want to place a context of what poetry looked like for him in the scope of how poetry developed over time. And so I was just in the other Hume class a little while ago, and I was talking about some literature and worked backwards to see where we ended up. But for us to see where poetry really fits in, we need to see where it goes. And so really quickly, I think you'll be able to get a visual of what we're dealing with here and why poetry is the way it is during John Donne's time. So this is a sonnet by Shakespeare, contemporary of Donne. Many of Donne's poems look exactly like this. In fact, all of his sonnets look like this. We can tell that it's very symmetrical, it's structured. There's always 14 lines. There's always a particular rhyme scheme. And almost always there's 10 syllables to a line. So everything is very, very precise. Poetry was exact, okay? But over time, when the rules started to open up a little bit, this is in the Romantic era, still very structured, but now there's sort of this beginning, middle, and end. This is by John Keats. Eventually it morphs into the mid-1800s where Walt Whitman kind of gets rid of most of those rules, and it becomes sounding like prose. There's really no difference. If you were to read this out loud, it would sound like normal prose writing, not poetry. And then all of that gets blown up by the time the modernists come around, which I was just talking about with the other class. Now poetry doesn't look like anything that John Donne would ever think of writing. So, why is poetry the way it is for John Donne? Well, the history of poetry is important to know because poetry used to be the only respected literary art form. That's all there was. There was drama, but people didn't usually read drama. Poetry was it. Things like short stories, even novels, didn't exist. So when someone was talking about literature, what they were talking about was poetry. The reason why it was so respected and regarded as this elite art form up there, probably not quite at the time of the Renaissance with painting or sculpting, but as a literary creation, is because of its precision. People who were poets were thought to have mastered the craft of measuring out every single, not just line, not even just word, but every single syllable. And if you could get it just right and then have good meaning with it, well, you were a master. You were a truly creative person, and you were a poet. Obviously, that's changed over time. And so the thinking back then was, well, anything that's longer or anything that has, they couldn't conceive of something having 300 pages, a novel, and being artistic. They think, what are all those wasted words? Like, there's no way all of those words are important. And that's true. You can cut out portions of novels and it doesn't affect it at all. So they viewed poetry as the highest form of literary art because it had to be precise. So when we read poetry, especially during this time period, what we should be thinking is, this author has created this poem in a very specific way and for a very specific reason. Every single mark on the page has a purpose. Now, that's where it can get a little bit tedious if you're not used to doing it, and I know that's not always the most fun thing, but that's how I want you to think about John Donne's writing. We're going to spend a lot of time on message and some themes and techniques, but on your own time, when you go to read these pieces again, I want you to go very slowly and look at every single word because they're there for a reason. It's not a novel where I could say a whole bunch of things and it probably doesn't affect the plot. Everything a poet does when he's writing a sonnet like this matters. So I think you're going to watch a film over the next few days about an English professor who is facing her mortality. And in the film, she has discussions. She's a John Donne expert, and so she has discussions about Donne. And one of the poems that you'll see that they talk about in the film is this, one of the most famous ones, is Holy Sonnet 10. And the discussion that takes place in the film, so make sure you pay attention to it when you watch it, is the tiniest variations of the text. Actually, the text that's referred to in the film, I've never actually seen. It's a very obscure text, but these are the two most common. And as you give a glancing look at it, you probably don't notice any difference. But can you see anything that's slightly different between the one on the left and the one on the right? Corey, what do you see?
There's a comma right at death on the left, where the second one doesn't have a comma. So the first one says...
Which line are you in?
First line.
First line? Okay.
First one says death,
Good.
be not proud, and the second one says death, be not proud. There's no pause.
Good. Okay. Teeny tiny comma, you think, who cares? It matters. I promise. Any other little changes? About the last line, you see any difference?
Death is capitalized.
Death has capital letters in some places. So what does it mean when something's capitalized versus not capitalized? Does that change the meaning of the poem? Many would argue, yes, it does. All right. So I know that's getting very specific, but this is what we talk about when we talk about poetry. It's every word matters. even every symbol matters, whether it's a punctuation symbol or how a letter is written. It might change the meaning, so always look very, very closely. So be aware of Sonnet 10 when you watch that film.